Simone de Beauvoir was born in 1908 and died in 1986. She is one of the most famous feminist philosophers and one of the most famous existentialist philosophers as well. Some of her notable works include The Second Sex, which was a hugely important, a key text in second wave feminism, and probably the work she is most famous for, I would argue, and I think many others would argue, not just me. And then there's the Ethics of Ambiguity, which is the one this video is actually going to focus on. Simone de Beauvoir was someone who actually is part of this legendary kind of philosophical couple with Jean-Paul Sartre, and both of them together really, I guess you could say, define what existentialism is, because of course that name existentialism to previous philosophers that they apply this name to, that didn't exist and they didn't call themselves existentialists. But you get from the claim of Sartre and de Beauvoir, they argue there's this tradition that starts back with Soren Kierkegaard and then moves on through people like Friedrich Nietzsche and up through them, and as well as Albert Camus, Franz Kafka, Fyodor Dostoevsky, and so on, of this movement of inquiring and seeing philosophy as the principal way in which we question and understand our being, because our being for them is something peculiar. It is unlike other beings in that we are faced with the reality of, one of these things, our own death. That we are faced with the possibility that we can question our being, what it means to be, and ask questions like, why do we exist at all? And what should we do in this life, of course, that we have? And so I wanted at the end of the semester to look at the ethics of ambiguity, because I think it is, I would say, the text that best, I think, outlines the values of existentialism as practiced by the French philosophers, de Beauvoir and Sartre and Albert Camus, the way in which they see existentialism. I really think this book just kind of is a nice complete outline of that movement. But I also wanted to look at it because in certain ways I think it takes the criticism that Nietzsche gives to philosophy. That I said, Nietzsche is known for taking a hammer to philosophy. And I think in one way we can see this book is de Beauvoir is giving a more positive answer, I think, to Nietzsche, where she's not rejecting Nietzsche's claim, of course, that there is no inherent given morality, that there are no transcendental truths. De Beauvoir accepts that, but I think she gives you something that is a little bit more easy to grab onto and work with, as opposed to maybe feeling that Nietzsche leaves you kind of in the cold, although, of course, Nietzsche wouldn't argue that. He sees himself as trying to get back to and preserve a certain noble ethics and ideals of the triumphant and so on. But still, nonetheless, I think he leaves many people with that feeling, and I think for this reason, Simone de Beauvoir's book, The Ethics of Ambiguity, can be seen as maybe like a building upon Nietzsche in a more positive manner. And of course, existentialism is, I would say, this isn't to denigrate it, but it's more what you could call, I guess, like a pop philosophy. Not that it's not serious. It is very serious. But it's more one, I think, that because of what it says is the product of philosophy, what it aims to do, it speaks to the human condition, of which then we all kind of on this uncritical way kind of realize, and I think you'll see once we really dive into the book and the arguments presented by de Beauvoir. It's also the kind of thing that you'll find, on like a coffee table or something like that. Like you won't find Hegel's phenomenology of spirit or Kant's first critique or Aristotle's metaphysics or anything like that on coffee tables that you can just kind of pick up and read. But you can find existentialist texts on coffee tables that you can kind of pick up and flip through the pages a little bit and read and get something out of it in a, I think, a more profound way that doesn't necessarily require the dense reading that a Kant or Hegel or Aristotle or Aquinas, whoever, might require. Okay, so let's just get into the text then. So, de Beauvoir's claim is that the human condition is ambiguous. It is ambiguous in that, she says, he escapes from his natural condition without, however, freeing himself from it. He is still a part of this world of which he is a consciousness. And what she's getting at there is all of us, in the fact that we can use reason and we are conscious of our existence in a certain way, we at certain times bracket, put aside maybe parts of our existence and we can reflect on it in ways in which we seemingly free ourselves from the kind of givenness and maybe determinateness of the natural world, and we can reflect on it and ask, well, why do we do this? Maybe we should do something else, and which seems to give us freedom, but it is ultimately ambiguous, de Beauvoir is arguing, because we are never actually entirely free from the world itself, and this way in which we still, are one part of us is basically, animal, right? We have these feelings and these sentiments and instincts, but then on the other hand, we say, no, we have reason, right? And de Beauvoir claims that the philosophers in the Western tradition, from Plato, Aristotle, to Stoicism, Aquinas, Hume, Kant, Mill, etc., that they all have tried to reduce one side of the antitheses of, it could be the subject-object antithesis, to the other side. What she means by that, here I'll read from pages 7 to 9. What she means by that is, as she writes, as long as there have been men and they have lived, they have all felt this tragic ambiguity of their condition. But as long as there have been philosophers and they have thought, most of them have tried to mask it. And that is what she means by reducing one side of the antithesis to the other. For example, they have striven to reduce mind to matter. What she means there is, in the case of, take like a materialist maybe tries to say, well, really this ambiguity where we are both, human beings that have bodies, but we also have minds that are immaterial, while certain philosophers would try to argue, no, actually there's just only the material. Maybe a more kind of Marxist argument would make such a claim that that's what you need to focus on, or not the kind of like immaterial stuff. And certainly in the case of mini analytic, more pro-science, I guess, or science, more of those that I think follow the kind of scientism, that kind of religion of science being the be-all and end-all. That in that way they seek to reduce the ambiguity, right? The thing that is unclear about our existence, and saying, no, really, it's the object which is real. And so object would be, we talk about objects in the world like this glass is an object, and that it is just a thing that exists, which cannot exert itself on other things, but is exerted upon by me doing whatever I want with this glass. But subjects, of course, are able to have wills that exert upon other things. And so, in certain cases, I exert my subjectivity onto this object in the way that I use it and judge it and so on. And then there are other times, of course, where we as subjects turn other subjects into objects and don't treat them as beings who can think, but are beings just to be purely, used. And in that way, whatever it may be, right, she's just trying to argue, though, that the philosophers throughout history have basically tried to overcome this, the ambiguity that is at the heart of the human condition. So in the case of reducing mind to matter, or she says to reabsorb matter into mind, so in the case of like maybe a Hegelian, an idealist, like the Irish bishop George Berkeley, who argued everything is really just mind or spirit, and in that way we can, kind of get at some certainty about the human condition. Or she says to merge them within a single substance, that they're both of the same kind, and that way, really like maybe the delusion that there's some difference between the material bodily aspect of our existence of having a body and the mind is just an illusion, that they're really just all the same thing. De Beauvoir is saying what philosophers attempt to do is basically overcome this problem. And so let's just use some cases that we looked at this semester. Take Plato, for example, with his argument about the theory of the forms, that, what isn't real is like the shadows, right? So going back to the allegory of the cave, that the shadows are not real, of course, our opinions, they are less than, they are imperfect. And that what is real is only that which is the immaterial, permanent form, these ideas like the beauty, the good, true, knowledge, wisdom, justice, these immaterial concepts which kind of cut through the flux of the world, right? And in that way, Plato tries to get at some certainty. In the case of Stoicism, they do this by, of course, rejecting anything having to do with our passions, and instead we should rely on reason and not be controlled by our passions. They would try to overcome this ambiguity in that way. Hume is interesting in that he, of course, doesn't deny reason, but he thinks, of course, as he argues, reason is a slave to the passions. And so Hume then tries to put more emphasis then on the passionate, animalistic side of human nature as opposed to the more rational side. And in the case of Kant, of course, Kant says, no, when we want to inquire into ethical matters, all that matters is that rational law, which is universal and consistent, and we don't take any, empirical concerns into the equation of an ethical principle, that we don't, consult our feelings in regard to ethics. So she says, those who have accepted the dualism have established a hierarchy between body and soul, that maybe they say, yes, there is this ambiguity, but it can be resolved, or we have this hierarchy where in the case of like Descartes, he says, yes, we are both bodies and minds, but we are truly actually minds which have a more legitimate role over our bodies, which permits, she says, of considering as negligible the part of the self which cannot be saved, which is the bodily self. They have denied death either by integrating it with life or by promising to man immortality. By, of course, saying, again, this world is not the real one, it's the afterlife, right? So in that way, they try to get over this ambiguity of our human existence, where we are at one and the same time these beings that exist in the world and have, a multitude of flux of emotions, and yet also have goals that seem to be things that are long-term, ideals that are consistent, and so on. Maybe even transcendental, we might try and argue. Or she says, again, they have denied life, considering it as a veil of illusion beneath which is hidden the truth of nirvana. And in this case, she is trying to argue against Buddhism in this way. So she says, the ethics which they have proposed to their disciples has always pursued the same goal. It has been a matter of eliminating the ambiguity by making oneself pure inwardness or pure externality, by escaping from the sensible world or by being engulfed by it, by yielding to eternity or enclosing oneself in the pure moment. So what de Beauvoir is arguing is going to be an ethics that embraces the ambiguity of the human condition. It does not seek to, one could say, run from it, or really does not seek to deny this ambiguity by favoring one side of this antithetical understanding of our condition as compared to the other. The philosophy of existentialism is, as I mentioned, a philosophy of the human condition. And in understanding some of the core claims of existentialism, I think there are two good quotes that come from Jean-Paul Sartre, which I think sum it up very well, which we can just use as a starting place. The first is that existence precedes essence. Now, what is meant by that is that whoever it is we are, however we define ourselves, existentialists argue that the fact of our existence precedes whatever it is we are. That if we take the essence as that one true thing, which is really at the core of what makes us human, or makes Austin Austin, that we are not bound to whatever it is we are defined by, but instead our existence precedes then that definition of who we truly are, what it really means to be human. In that sense, then, Sartre also claims man is condemned to be free, because since existence precedes essence, since we have the ability then to not be bound to some definition of what a human being is, of what it means to be a human being in the 21st century, of roles like gender roles or whatever it may be, right? That this means for Sartre, man is condemned to be free. That we are free to choose whoever we want to become. But this is not something that is entirely free of burden. In fact, there is a great burden that comes with freedom, which is why Sartre says we are condemned to be free. And that is, of course, to take one example, existential angst. The fact that we can choose, existentialists argue, to be whoever we want to be, that's a lot of weight. How do we know if we want to? How do we know if we make the right choice or not? And we all kind of experience this at some certain point in time that we refer to as like midlife crises or quarter life crises or whatever it may be. That at one point in our lives we realize, oh, I am being toward death. So this is a term taken from Heidegger. I am necessarily a being which is always, no matter what, going towards my death. That is always kind of in the back of my mind. And at some points in our time, because that means we have a limited time on Earth, then that means we can't just do everything. We have to make choices. And how do we know if we've made the right choice or not? And so sometimes we experience this existential angst, this kind of maybe crippling anxiety about what do I do? Have I made the right choice? I don't know what to do in this case, and so on. In some cases, we experience existential dread or despair, I should say, when we are afraid of this fact that we are being towards necessarily being toward death. So, because existentialism then claims that existence precedes essence, that we are then free to choose who we want to be, they deny that there is any inherent meaning in the world, that there is nothing which says, we must pursue this path in life because that is the right thing to do, and it's the kind of purpose of our existence. Now, there's an objection against this, which de Beauvoir mentions, and this objection says basically that existentialism encloses, is kind of limiting humanity into an empty subjectivity where, well, there's no real purpose or meaning then, because since there's no given or inherent meaning, it doesn't matter what we do at all. That, as de Beauvoir kind of characterizes this objection, she says that it is incapable of furnishing him with any principle for making choices. That we're kind of just lost to do whatever we want and it doesn't matter at all. Now, a lot of this text is going to be basically arguing against this objection, and we'll see that we'll, in a certain way, come back to this at the end of the text. But her argument against this objection is that there can be no ethics at all where there is no choice, where there is the absolute and perfection, where ought is. That if there is some path in life which is already, somehow the clear, correct thing to do, that whether it be that it has been determined by God, or that reason, we'll take in the case of Kant or something like that, says this is, what we ought to do no matter what. De Beauvoir has a line against this, and it is my favorite quote from her. She says, "One does not offer an ethics to a God. One does not offer an ethics to a God." Think about that. What would it mean for God to have an ethics? How could God have an ethics? And she continues this by saying, "It is impossible to propose any to man, if one defines him as nature as something given. It's impossible to propose an ethics to man if one defines him as nature as something given, as something which already works according to some law of the universe, which is necessarily the true and the correct way, and which is the way in which it will always inevitably go to." Why? Because for de Beauvoir, ethics necessarily entails choice. And this is part of that existential angst and anxiety, that we do actually have choices. We can make the wrong choices as opposed to the right. And there is, as we'll see, never any truly right choice. Just kind of, void of our existence. But again, going back to that quote, "One does not offer an ethics to a God," it would be because God, to take the omni-God, right, all-knowing, all-loving, all-powerful, God would, as God then is defined according to this, apparently know exactly what the objective truth is, and therefore, in doing so, since going back to Nietzsche and the way that de Beauvoir is influenced, right, truth, being, ethics, these are necessarily related. You can't entirely separate one from the other. Then the being of God is necessarily determined by then what is true. And God would have no choice about what God could ultimately do. Because then, God would have to be all-loving. God could not choose to be evil and vindictive or whatever. In that way, then, it doesn't make sense to talk about ethics in relation to a God. But it does make sense to talk about ethics in relation to human beings, which are not, de Beauvoir is arguing, defined by the absolute, by the objective. There can only be an ethics, she argues, for a being who questions their being. A being who is at a distance from himself and who has to be his being. What she means by this is, there can only be an ethics for a being who is not entirely comfortable with their existence. And the fact that we have choices means the stakes are high, since, of course, we necessarily will eventually die. We can't do everything. The fact that the human condition is ambiguous and that we don't know everything, we're not pure reason, we don't know absolute truth. We are swayed by our instincts and our feelings. And how can we ever be sure that at one point in time when we think we're arguing something true, how can we not be entirely sure that it's not being influenced by our feelings? So she says, the being of humanity is created by assuming the failure of being. What she means by the failure of being is a being which is entirely present, which is entirely giving, which is complete. And since the human condition is ambiguous, the being of human is not complete, which is why existence precedes essence. So, here, reading from page 12 to 13, she says, "This end which man proposes to himself by making himself lack of being is in effect realized by him. By uprooting himself from the world, man makes himself present to the world, and makes the world present to him. I should like to be the landscape which I am contemplating. I should like this sky, this quiet water, to think themselves within me. that it might be I whom they express in flesh and bone, and I remain at a distance. But it is also by this distance that the sky and the water exist before me. My contemplation is an excruciation only because it is also a joy. I cannot appropriate the snowfield where I slide. It remains foreign, forbidden. But I take delight in this very effort toward an impossible possession. I experience it as a triumph, not as a defeat. This means that man, in his vain attempt to be God, a perfect being, makes himself exist as man. And if he is satisfied with his existence, he coincides exactly within himself. It is not granted him to exist without tending toward this being which he will never be, but it is possible for him to want this tension, even with the failure which it involves. His being is lack of being, but this lack has a way of being which is precisely existence. So, she says then, the task of an existentialist ethics is to be honest in this ambiguity, to be honest about this incomplete position of being human, to be genuine about it, and ultimately, by not attempting, quote, to dispel the ambiguity of his being, but, on the contrary, accept the task of realizing it. So here are some requirements. There are 4 of them I've outlined here from the text. The first, de Beauvoir argues, is that one must accept that there is no absolute. There is no objective, inherent meaning to our existence. There is no purpose of which it is our job to go out there and define what it exactly is and mold our lives to that. Now, of course, one could object, if there is no God or no absolute, isn't everything permitted? She says to this, the contrary is the case. Because man is abandoned on the earth, because his acts are definitive, absolute engagements. He bears the responsibility for a world which is not the work of a strange power, but of himself, where his defeats are inscribed, and his victories as well. A God can pardon, efface, and compensate. But if God does not exist, man's faults are inexpiable. So, everything is not permitted if there is no objective given meaning, no objective ethics. If there is no God, everything is not permitted, because what de Beauvoir is saying is actually that means the responsibility for being human is actually greater than it ever could be if there was a God. Because, in the case of there being a God, she's saying, eventually justice would come. All the sins would be righted in the afterlife. One way or the other, of course. But if there is no God, then we can't just atone for our sins. In fact, every action we perform has the greatest weight imaginable, because it cannot be taken back. It is irrevocable. And with that, the most serious responsibility, she's saying, lies in the existence of being human. Secondly, one must reject impersonal humanity as a source for all values. That we cannot then seek to try to come at some definition of this impersonal, human being, in which then we say, well, all human beings possess this thing, so then we say, well, what is it that would make us all relate to one another, so that then we can determine what a supreme ethical principle would be, like as we saw in the case of Immanuel Kant. Because in this way, we would begin to try and basically set up still some objective that wouldn't be based on any absolute or religious foundation. But again, a potential objection to this. Well, if you can't have this impersonal humanity which could claim to objectivity, then this would be some kind of a subjective ethics. And if ethics is subjective, isn't it true there can't be any objective content to a moral act? Her reply is, it is not impersonal man who is the source of values, but the plurality of concrete particular men, projecting themselves toward their ends on the basis of situations whose particularity is as radical and as irreducible as subjectivity itself. That there is objective content to our moral actions. It's not just entirely subjective that we make of it whatever it is we want, because it is an ethics which is necessarily interrelated. It necessarily entails the existence of other human beings as well, and as she says, projecting ourselves towards certain ends to realize those ends, which in the case then they would have real content to them. Thirdly, she says, one must accept then this interrelatedness of ethics. But if ethics is subjective, in this case again, can't each person act egoistically? Why must they accept this interrelatedness of ethics? Well, she says to this, an ethics of ambiguity will be one which will refuse to deny a priori, so prior to experience or prior to any action, anything else, beforehand, it will be to refuse to deny this a priori that separate existence can, at the same time, be bound to each other, that their individual freedoms can forge laws valid for all. And the reason for this is why existentialism would be would deny this a priori kind of necessary relation we must have to each other, is that it would deny then individual freedom. And this leads to then the fourth requirement. One must be conscious of one's own freedom and the freedom of others. Existentialism is a philosophy of freedom. But again, a potential objection. If existence precedes essence, then isn't one free to treat others as object in order to disclose their being? Isn't one free to treat someone else as they will in order to pursue whatever path they think is what they should pursue in life, to make, maybe they want to become a tyrant? Well, de Beauvoir says to this, in order for men to become indignant or to admire, they must be conscious of their own freedom and the freedom of others. Thus, everything occurs within each man and in the collective tactics as if men were free. Because I necessarily then, in negating the freedom of others, begin to determine my own path, as we'll see, and don't truly make myself free. And I'm going to pause on fully fleshing this out because we'll come back to this later on in the text. But these are the basic four requirements here, right? That there is this rejection of any inherent meaning in our existence, that there is it's necessarily individualistic. It is still interrelated, though, with other human beings, and it's based on the freedom, then, of the individual and then the freedom of others. The aim, then, we could say, of an existentialist ethics is to genuinely realize the ambiguity of existence, to what de Beauvoir calls will oneself free. She says, to will oneself free is to effect the transition from nature to morality. To bring into being, then, this transition from this attempt at some perfect, definite, certain definition and limiting of our existence, to instead assuming the ambiguity of our existence by establishing a genuine freedom on the original upsurge, then, of our existence. And again, she says, nothing is decided in advance, and it is because man has something to lose, and because he can lose, that he can also win. So the stakes are high in that, yes, the choices matter in what you do, of course. You can make terrible mistakes. You might not achieve whatever plan it is you have in life if you want to become a famous artist. Okay, you can try that. You might fail and end up poor. You might try to go about solving some big problem solving cancer or something in the world and maybe try to develop a vaccine, and it ends up you hurt people for some reason. I don't know, it wasn't tested properly or whatever, right? There are real consequences to our actions. But, and this is the Nietzschean influence, because of that, because the potential loss is real, that means de Beauvoir is arguing the potential joy and the potential of winning, of really achieving what you set out then, is as high as the opposite of what then the negative consequences are, being low. Now, the antithesis to then this aim of willing oneself free would be to have what Sartre calls bad faith. De Beauvoir calls this bad willing, but because the term bad faith is much more prominent, I'm just going to use that term bad faith. Now, of course, then de Beauvoir is saying we then, to assume this ambiguity of ourselves and to not deny that our existence is ambiguous, it's not given, it's not perfect, it's not definite, it's not laid out for us with this necessary path we have to take in life. There are ways in which we do not do this. And this is called bad faith. It is when we pretend we are not free. And this can be, so de Beauvoir thinks we can't actually will ourselves to not be free. We can't actually will that we have this definite path that we must, no matter what, pursue. Because that would be contradictory to the nature of our own being as Dasein, as this being which is aware of itself, and which is therefore, because it's aware of itself, it can question its own being. Most of the time we pretend, we pretend no matter what that we're not free, but most of the time it's done unconsciously. But there are cases where we consciously deny then this, where we really know we are free, but we kind of still don't want to believe it. But de Beauvoir would say, we can't actually not believe it. Deep down, we really know that we are free. So she says, my freedom must not seek to trap being, but to disclose it. And by pretending we are not free, I trap being because I limit my possibilities for my existence, of what I can pursue in my life. So what is bad faith then? Yes, it's a pretending one is not free. But how does this occur? It occurs, she says, when once there appears a possibility of liberation, it is resignation of freedom not to exploit the possibility, a resignation which implies dishonesty and which is a positive fault, because we actively then bring about this bad willing, this denial of our ambiguity, this denial that we are free. Now, there are different kinds of bad faith that she outlines, and I'm going to discuss these here. There are 6, well, there's really 7, and we'll come to the 7th, actually, in the second video lecture. But we'll look at the first 6 here. The first is what she calls the child. The child is thrown into a world where it believes ready-made values objectively exist. And she refers to this way in which we have bad faith as being a child because, well, one, because of our culture, the way society exists, we necessarily are raised in such a way that, she says, we look up to our parents, basically, we see them, we have questions because we are, trying to find our way in this world, so we ask questions, why, right? And our parents seemingly always give us answers that they just seem to know. They seem to have life figured out. And that makes being a child very easy because it's safe. It's comfortable. You can enjoy without any worry. There's no anxiety in being the child. And ultimately, too, the parents basically don't really give the child a choice in what to do, but have to do as the parents say. She says, The child's situation is characterized by his finding himself cast into a universe which he has not helped to establish, which has been fashioned without him, and which appears to him as an absolute to which he can only submit. That the child considers values as ready-made things. Now, the child is actually extremely important for existentialism because it is, because we all at one point in time definitely have been the child, of course, because society necessarily raises children in this way, and to some extent it is necessary. But of course there does come a point where we do start to question, where we start to realize, wait a second, maybe our parents aren't the gods we kind of, these infallible creatures that we thought they were. They maybe actually can get things wrong too. And there's certain points in our existence too when we start to realize in adulthood, man, like, I don't have this thing figured out. Like, basically, I'm just, like, in certain ways we ask ourselves, when am I going to have this thing figured out? Because we see certain people who it seems like they have figured out life, right? And in this way, then we want to believe and tend to believe that, well, maybe there actually really are ready-made given values, we just have to discover them, right? And in this way, then, in being the child, de Beauvoir is saying we have bad faith, that we deny our actual freedom because we think, no, there actually is something necessary that then we must figure out what it is and then live our lives according to it. And in this way, then, we would, I guess you could say, act unethical, right? Okay, the next is then the subman. The subman is the person who rejects the human condition of freedom, that they reject this condition that existence precedes essence by refusing to make decisions, refusing to disclose their own being because of an inability to cope with an absurd world where meaning is not given. Now, this person is different from the child in that the child has a certain ignorance to themselves. The subman, on the other hand, is not ignorant, but basically they are either afraid or they just outright just don't have an inability, or they don't have an ability to cope with this ambiguity of human existence, that there is no inherent meaning in the world. In this way, then, the subman too strives for, in this way you can think of some people in the way in which some people in their lives, they kind of have a difficult break maybe from maybe they grew up religious, and maybe one day they realize, like, hey, I think this religion is all nonsense, and that they feel like they've been lied to, but like they think, well, there must be something in the world then that is true, because a world in which there is no given meaning for me to pursue is a world in which it is dark and scary, and ultimately it's something that I just can't accept no matter what. And then this person would maybe bounce around from religion to religion, or self-help guru or self-help book to self-help book, searching for that thing which they think is then this true value, this true path in life, which then they must, of course, seek out and find. And so she says, the subman rejects this passion which is his human condition, the laceration and the failure of that drive toward being which always misses its goal, but which thereby is the very existence which he rejects. He discovers around him only an insignificant and dull world. How could this naked world arouse within him any desire to feel, to understand, to live? The less he exists, the less is there reason for him to exist, since these reasons are created only by existing. So she says, thus we have defined in the subman as a denial and a flight. The subman is not a harmless creature. He realizes himself in the world as a blind, uncontrolled force which anybody can get control of. And this is what makes the subman dangerous then, because the subman can become the object of vindictive people who, in many ways, the subman basically becomes the sheep. She says, the subman wakes his way across a world deprived of meaning toward a death which merely confirms his long negation of himself. The only thing revealed in this experience is the absurd facticity of an existence which remains forever unjustified if it has not known how to justify itself. All right, let's turn to the third kind of bad faith. The third way in which we will our existence badly, in which we deny our freedom. This is what she calls the serious man. The serious man denies their freedom by losing their self in the object they make their purpose in life, by selling out everything else to it, and denying they can do otherwise. So the serious man is the one who thinks that they do have a true purpose, a vocation, a calling in life. Or maybe it's one they create, but they think this is like really worthwhile pursuing, and if I don't get it, then my life is a failure, and I might as well kill myself or something like that if I don't get it. This person has bad faith because they too deny their freedom by imposing on themselves this definite end which they must achieve, which then defines their existence. So she says of the serious man, the attitude of the subman passes logically over into that of the serious man. He forces himself to submerge his freedom in the content which the latter accepts from society. He loses himself in the object in order to annihilate his subjectivity. And he does this, he annihilates his subjectivity because he no longer then has this an actual will to determine what they want to do, but instead then is defined and determined by that object of which then they've determined their life revolves around. And this can be, think of it as like a career, right? Or some other purpose in life that maybe not necessarily we could say is a career, but some calling which they feel like they must do or else they're a failure. So she says, the serious man gets rid of his freedom by claiming to subordinate it to values which would be unconditioned. He imagines that the accession to these values, likewise, permanently confers value upon himself. And the serious man then thinks he truly is giving himself an objective value. Shielded with rights, he fulfills himself as a being who is escaping from the stress of existence. The serious man's dishonesty issues from his being obliged ceaselessly to renew the denial of his freedom. He chooses to live in an infantile world, but to the child, the values are really given. Because, of course, the child is ignorant. They don't know yet that there aren't inherent given values in the world. The serious man, though, must mask the movement by which he gives them to himself. Like the mythomaniac who, while reading a love letter, pretends to forget that she has sent it to herself. So the serious man basically tries to lie to themselves that they have found this true meaning for their existence. So the serious man, she says, becomes a slave to his end. And in that way, then, the serious man's life actually does lose all meaning. All right, let's move on to the nihilist. The nihilist is the person who says, yes, okay, yeah, there is no inherent meaning in the world. The world is void of meaning. But in this way, she says, they end up willing their self to nothing. They choose no goal to pursue. and they don't pursue a goal given to them like the subman does. This will to nothingness, then, means not only the individual, but the entire world which interacts with the individual, that too is negated. And the nihilist, then, is right that there is no inherent meaning, right? So she's not taking that away from the nihilist, but they interpret this in a negative way. And what that means is actually, the nihilist thinks they are, the nihilist says, yes, there's no meaning to the world, but they basically deny then their existence, that they can construct a meaning, not an objective meaning, right? But they can still pursue goals in life. And what the nihilist actually ends up doing is still giving themselves meaning. They can't escape it, because the necessary condition of humanity is actually to will meaning one way or another. But, and so for the nihilists in this way, then they basically determine that their meaning is to then deny all meaning. So she says of the nihilist, conscious of being unable to be anything, man then decides to be nothing. The nihilist is close to the spirit of the seriousness, for instead of realizing his negativity as a living movement, he conceives his annihilation in a substantial way. Nihilism is disappointed seriousness, which has turned back upon itself. By this rejection, they end up drawing near to the subman. But the difference is that their withdrawal is not their original movement. At first, they cast themselves into the world, the nihilist does, sometimes even with a largeness of spirit. They exist and they know it. The problem is, the attitude of the nihilist can perpetuate itself as such only if it reveals itself as a positivity at its very core. Rejecting his own existence, the nihilist must also reject the existence which confirms it. If he wills himself to be nothing, all mankind must also be annihilated. Otherwise, by means of the presence of this world that the other reveals, he meets himself as a presence in the world. But this thirst for destruction immediately takes the form of a desire to power. And here's where then, here's the significant danger of the nihilist. She says, the taste of nothingness joins the original taste of being, whereby every man is first defined. He realizes himself as a being by making himself that by which nothingness comes into the world. And thus, Nazism was both a will for power and a will for suicide at the same time. So here then, the nihilist has a tendency to devolve into the fascist. So instead of integrating death into life, instead of integrating the fact of our being toward death and our finite existence, de Beauvoir says, the nihilist sees in it only truth of the life which appears to him as a disguised death. Alright, and then the final two, the fifth kind of bad faith, the adventurer. The adventurer is the person that sets out to make their self a purpose. They say, okay, yes, there is no inherent given meaning in the world of which I must figure out or I must define and limit my existence to and my path in life. So they say, yeah, I set out, I'll be the adventurer. I'll go out and see what are all the things I could pursue in life. Maybe, I could pursue some philosophy. Maybe then I could travel the world. Maybe I want to become a lawyer, and then maybe I could work in a factory and feel like I contribute some material way to society. And in that way, the adventurer would say, yes, well, I'm creating meaning in all these different kinds of ways. I'm basically bringing meaning out of this empty world. The problem is that in setting out to make themselves a purpose, that they end up detaching themselves from their goal, which means they end up having no core beliefs at all. And that means they can easily help or hurt the freedom of others. In this way, they end up rejecting the objectivity of their existence. Because remember, again, in the Ethics of Ambiguity, Simone de Beauvoir is saying, you don't, again, say, oh, our existence is all subjective or it's all objective, but you accept that it is both. And the problem with the adventurer is they reject then the objectivity of their existence by kind of swaying from one path, one goal to the other. So she says of the adventurer does not propose to be. He deliberately makes himself a lack of being. He aims expressly at existence. Though engaged in his undertaking, he is at the same time detached from the goal. Whether he succeeds or fails, he goes right ahead, throwing himself into a new enterprise to which he will give himself with the same indifferent ardor. Behind the appearance of caprice, there are many men who pursue a secret goal in utter seriousness. So the attitude of the adventurer is not always pure, though. For example, fortune or glory. It also happens that the genuine love for adventure is inextricably mixed with an attachment to the values of the serious. And in this way, then, they fall into some of the traps of the serious man. What distinguishes the adventurer from a simple game, though, is that the adventurer does not limit himself to asserting his existence in solitary fashion. He asserts it in relationship to other existences. He has to declare himself. So two attitudes then are possible, she says. The adventurer can become conscious of the real requirements of his own freedom, which can will itself only by destining itself to an open future, by seeking to extend itself by means of the freedom of others. Therefore, in any case, the freedom of others must be respected and they must be helped to free themselves. But the man who acts in this way, whose end is the liberation of himself and others, who forces himself to respect this end through the means which he uses to attain it, no longer deserves the name of adventurer then. One is in the presence of a genuinely free man. And so that way, the adventurer can escape the bad faith and become a genuinely free man and assume and accept our ambiguity. Now, part of the danger, too, of the adventurer is that she says, thus confusing a quite external availability with real freedom, and that they can just pursue whatever they want, he falls with a pretext of independence into the servitude of the object. And then in serving the object, she says, favorable circumstances have the potential to arise and are enough then to transform the adventurer into a dictator. The dictator carries the seed of one within him, since he regards mankind as indifferent matter destined to support the game of his existence, which is fleeing from one thing which seems fun to the next. And in that way, then, other people can become treated as objects as opposed to subjects. Finally, we have the passionate man. The passionate man, then, is is kind of the opposite of the adventurer, where for the passionate man, content is genuinely filled. So for the passionate man, then, there is objectivity. But there is no subjectivity. There is no creation in their being because the passionate man ends up rejecting too much of their freedom to pursue other things and becomes passionate only, or basically subsumes too much of their freedom that willing to, maybe we could say one or a handful of objects. So she says of the passionate man, what characterizes the passionate man is that he sets up the object as an absolute, not like the serious man, as a thing detached from himself, but instead the passionate man does this as a thing disclosed by his subjectivity, that he only feels himself free then in kind of enslaving himself to this object. He causes certain rare treasures to appear in the world, but he also depopulates it. Nothing exists outside of his stubborn project. Therefore, nothing can induce him to modify his choices. And having enjoyed his whole life with an external object, which can eventually escape him, he tragically feels his dependence. Even if it does not definitely disappear, the object never gives itself. The passionate man makes himself a lack of being, not that there might be being, but in order to be. So the passionate man, although it seems they truly are assuming the ambiguity of their existence, deep down inside they really want to finally achieve then that definite existence, which rids away then the ambiguity of their existence. And ultimately then he remains at a distance he is never fulfilled. And so then the passionate man is tormented, she says, because of the distance from his object. So, again, what we looked at in this video lecture then is de Beauvoir tries to say that there is this fundamental ambiguity about human existence, which of course revolves around then us simultaneously being an object and a subject, as being, having a body and a mind, which is, material and immaterial, of being kind of animalistic but also rational, and that they advocate then this assuming and a kind of genuine acceptance then of our ambiguous existence in such a way then that we will and accept this freedom to determine for ourselves what path in life we want, because there is then no given inherent meaning to our existence. But again, that doesn't mean then we do whatever we want, because as we'll see in the next video lecture especially, this depends on the freedom of others, and that there are ways in which we can deny our freedom, and this is called bad faith or bad willing, where ultimately what we do is we deny that we have this freedom at all to choose what we want. So we'll see how this continues to evolve in the next video lecture.